Why did George Lucas sell Star Wars to Disney? This is a question I know we've all been pondering, and I'm looking forward to getting into detail as to why this happened. And I'm pulling all the information I'm discussing with you today from The Ride of a Lifetime, a book written by Robert Iger, the president and CEO of Disney. And in this book, he does not only discuss the acquisition of Star Wars, he also goes into detail discussing the acquisitions of Marvel, Pixar, his experience as CEO of Disney, as well as experience as president of ABC and other executive positions before that. Before I get into this content though, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications bell so you don't miss the next episode. I greatly appreciate it. To begin, it's important to discuss the history that both George Lucas and Bob Iger had with each other prior to this engagement of this Star Wars acquisition. Bob Iger was president of ABC for several years. During his presidency, they helmed many very popular projects such as Twin Peaks, which elevated the network and their TV series. This attracted the attention of a lot of really big directors and their interest involved with the channel. One of them was George Lucas. George Lucas was very much so ambitious and enthralled by the idea of producing a young Indiana Jones series which would be an educational journey where children and teens can enjoy watching a young Indiana Jones meet historical figures, learn about historical monuments and such. It was a very exciting prospect for George Lucas, and Bob Iger was very much so excited to give him the platform to produce the series. After the first season aired, it enlisted a very high viewership. It was very high and very accepted by the audiences. However, it slowly fell off episode per episode, and it showed Bob Iger that this show was not going to be successful and did not warrant a second season. George was really upset that this happened, and he was really determined to do another season. He was very passionate about this project. He loved education, he loved teaching people, and he loved using entertainment as a means to do so. Bob Iger, out of respect for George and his true passion for George's ambition, he said, "George, I'll give you a second season." He gave him a second season, and he knew, Bob Iger had to have known it wasn't going to do much better. The first season had such a severe drop-off, and obviously that's a sign that people just weren't interested in watching. And people weren't interested in watching the second season either. It did not do well, it did not perform, and I imagine it cost the studio a lot of money. But George was very much so appreciative of this gesture that Bob Iger had for him, and in some way, at some point in time in the future, he was going to pay him back, which we have seen come to fruition. Many years after ABC was acquired by Disney, Bob Iger rose to the corporate ladder and eventually became CEO of Disney itself. And through his tenure as CEO, he acquired both Pixar and Marvel and eventually wanted Star Wars. He had his eye on Star Wars and was very much so interested in talking to George about that. So he set up a breakfast with George, and on the rededication day of Star Tours, which was already at some of the Disney parks in Orlando back in June 2011, he brought up buying Star Wars and was very humble, gracious, and showed his respect for the franchise, for the series, and for George's creative intelligence. And he pretty much told George that he'd be interested in buying, and he wanted to know what George thought. And George was not very interested in selling to him at that time. He had to think about it, and Bob was respectful, and he stepped back. And he didn't approach George after that. He let George make the decision for him, like if he wanted to do it or not. But in that meeting there that they had at breakfast, George told him that he would be the only man he would ever sell Star Wars to. I mean, man, that's a pretty big thing to say. He's the only guy that George Lucas would be willing to sell Star Wars to. That's just a lesson to show you how showing respect to somebody in a difficult time can go a long way. Because just showing that little gesture of giving George that extra season of the Young Indiana Jones series, that went a long way for Bob Iger and eventually got him the rights to Star Wars, which George wouldn't have given to anybody else if they hadn't had that encounter. It's really powerful stuff. And eventually, George did end up reaching out to Bob Iger 7 months later, and George said he wanted the Pixar deal. And the Pixar deal was a $7.4 billion deal. It was very big deal. And Bob Iger didn't believe that Lucasfilm and Star Wars was worth that. And you're probably wondering, like, wow, why would he think that? How could you possibly not fathom that Star Wars is worth that much? It's a huge series, one of the biggest entertainment giants in history. And something that Pixar had going for it at the time, according to the book, was that they had a lot of different movies that were in production and that were ready to be put into theaters, and it had a really big creative team, and the investment into Pixar encapsulated all of that. It wasn't just simply the name, and it wasn't just simply the previous films that have come out. There was a lot going into that. As for Lucasfilm, they hadn't really been working on any projects, and they would be buying ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, but as I mean, when it comes to the creatives, George Lucas was the big creator, and he was the creative voice for the entire series. And they also just didn't want him to rule the show anymore. So there was just less value that they considered with that. Surprisingly, the two gentlemen came up to an agreement as to what Star Wars was worth, the whole company of Lucasfilm, $4 billion, pretty earlier on in the negotiation. What was still up for grabs was creative control. George Lucas, of course, wanted to keep helming Star Wars, keep making more projects, writing movies, and all that such. Bob didn't want him involved anymore. He didn't want him retaining that creative control. He wanted to be able to have more of the say, and he's spending $4 billion on the series. Why wouldn't he have the agency to say what goes and what doesn't? He avoids. The problem is it's George's story. Everybody wants Star Wars from George's perspective, not from Disney's perspective. We want George Lucas Star Wars. And as we all can probably tell, ever since Disney's bought Star Wars, it's been pretty bad disaster, and they haven't really gone anywhere but down. They had a couple wins, of course, but what really is a hitter with this is that George had 3 movie outlines planned, if you weren't aware. He had 3 movie outlines planned and written, and he sold them to Disney. They bought his treatments for the sequel trilogy. They bought them, and they didn't use them. They wanted to make their own thing, and Bob Iger makes that pretty clear in this book as well. George considered this to be almost a promise that they would buy these outlines and that they would use them to produce the movies. Why else would you buy them if you didn't want to use them, right? So he was pretty disappointed later on when they chose not to. Something else that really hindered this entire negotiation for George when it came to creative control, because why wouldn't he just hold out, right? Why wouldn't he hold out and wait for Disney to, fall a little bit and succumb to his needs and his wants involved in this negotiation? Well, he was stuck. He was stuck because, here I quote on page 182 of the book, quote, "It was an upcoming change in capital gains laws that eventually salvaged the negotiations. If we didn't close the deal by the end of 2012, George, who owned Lucasfilm outright, would take a roughly $500 million hit on the sale." End quote, page 182. With that being said, he had to sell fast, or else the evaluation of his company would be worth $500 million less. I mean, that's a huge amount, $3.5 billion to $4 billion. He was really restrained on his power, and his leverage just went through the floor after that happened. And this is another quote I pulled from the same page. Quote, "He knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept. And so he reluctantly agreed to be available to consult with us at our request." End quote, page 182. And through this, and also for further dialogue in the book, Bob Iger pretty much promised that they would be open to his ideas and that they wanted him for consultative purposes. Can you tell me how many times have we, as the public, have been aware that George Lucas has been involved for some sort of consultative purpose in Star Wars? I can't remember the last time I heard anything like that. I think the only times we've ever seen George Lucas's involvement in the series was when we would see him on the set of Mandalorian, and they'd have behind the scenes footage where George would just appear. That was very limited, and I don't think it was ever alluded that he was necessarily involved with it either. We know that Dave Filoni was sort of his protege for a long time, but he's not George Lucas still. So this was all just a very, very misrepresented promise that we haven't seen into fruition. Eventually, of course, October 30th of 2012, George signed away an agreement for Disney to buy Lucasfilm, and from thus on forward, Disney owned Star Wars. Post-Star Wars acquisition from Disney, we saw a George Lucas that was very upset, demotivated, and frustrated with the series. George believed that although there was no contractual obligation to see his treatments fulfilled, that they were going to adapt it anyway. He was very disappointed in the first meeting he had with the Disney team, the creative team, that they weren't going to adapt his story treatments. And this is a quote from Bob Iger's perspective here. "Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessary rocky start." Page 184 to 185, end quote. He pretty much thought that they were going to use his films, or use his treatments, and why wouldn't they want to? If you just look up George Lucas Star Wars sequel trilogy, and you watch a video that somebody's made, or just watch a video of, I believe there's an interview of him discussing his ideas for the sequel trilogy, you'll think it's infinitely better than what we got. It'd be so much more interesting. What we had is just an absolute rehash of the past, and horribly implemented one at best. But going further down the line, prior to the global release of Star Wars The Force Awakens, Kathleen Kennedy, the new president of Lucasfilm, screened Force Awakens to George, and she accounts that he was visibly disappointed and quoted that he said that "there's nothing new." George, he really liked showing new stories, new characters, presenting exciting new technologies and new worlds. But they didn't really provide anything brand new, and George ridiculed that. And here's another quote I love from the book. Quote, "We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films, to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do." Furthermore, going on, George did not want to even visit the premiere. When the film premiered, he did not want to go. Another quote here. "He didn't want to come at first, but Kathy, with the help of George's now wife, Melody Hobson, convinced him it was the right thing to do." Wow. He didn't even want to attend the premiere of Force Awakens. I mean, do I need to spell it out for you? He's not happy with Force Awakens. And there's no way he followed that story. He followed that story any more than that, because he didn't even want to show up to the premiere. Shouldn't he be proud of what this new company is doing with his work if he actually respected them, or if he actually valued what they were bringing to the table? He did not. He did not value this. And although we haven't seen very much more from him regarding Last Jedi and the absolute wretched Rise of Skywalker, then I don't think he has anything positive to say, and he's certainly trying to avoid any sort of disparagement against the company, because he is a large stakeholder in Disney, so he has a lot of stock involved, and that's money that he has in the company that he's not selling. But something that was crazy that also happened after the premiere of the movie, not only was he so reluctant to see the premiere, an interview that he had, which was already filmed from a prior date before the premiere, George stated in the interview that he was frustrated that Disney was not adapting his previous treatments, and he said that selling to Disney was practically the equivalent of selling his kids to white slavers. He said that, to white slavers, the equivalent of selling Star Wars to Disney. It's like selling his children to white slavers. Now, I don't know what exactly that means, but there's not a single positive connotation that can come from that. So what else could be said that he does not respect Disney, and he did not respect where they were taking Star Wars? And I want to finish this video with one last quote from page 185, which just shows you how ironic acquisition from Disney has been, because this is just pure hypocrisy here. Quote, "One of the biggest mistakes that I've seen film studios make is getting locked into a release date and then letting that influence creative decisions, often rushing movies into production before they're ready." End quote, page 185. I mean, doesn't that sound like the entire case, especially for Rise of Skywalker? Have you guys seen that movie? Have you seen what an absolute mess it is? And I think these movies were coming out pretty soon after each other. These were not big, huge movies that took 5 years to make. These were quick. These were quick movies that they were just pulling out. Just keep them coming. It's like that with all these shows too. I mean, all these Disney Plus series are just quick little money grabs just to get your attention, keep you involved. Don't forget, we're Disney. We're making Star Wars. That's what they're doing here. So with all of this being said, just George was not happy with what Star Wars was doing, and don't believe that he was. So with all that being said, to conclude, it's obvious George Lucas has not been interested in what they've been doing, and I don't think he is approving of the Star Wars product that has been produced in the last few years. Certainly, he was not interested in the sequel trilogy, and if he did think so, he would say he liked them and he endorsed these movies, and he endorsed Star Wars. I know he recently came out and supported Bob Iger and his experience and his tenure as the Disney CEO, but I do not equivalent that as him supporting what they've done with Star Wars, because I think what Bob Iger did for him many years ago, giving him that chance with Young Indiana Jones and funding it a second time, I think that really gave George a lot of respect and admiration for the kind of man Bob Iger was. I don't know if he's that same man today, because Disney is an absolute trash heap, and these movies and TV shows are evidence of that. But make sure to let me know in the comments below what you thought of this review. Tell me what you know about George Lucas. If I forgot something, please make sure to tell me, because I'd like to know. Have you read The Ride of a Lifetime? I'm sounding like I really don't like this book. The book was really good. I enjoyed reading and listening to the book. But yeah, check out the book, The Ride of a Lifetime. It goes into a lot of detail about other important acquisitions such as Marvel and Pixar, and it was certainly interesting to learn more about that. And let me know in the comments below what you think of the new Star Wars movies, Star Wars projects, and make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications bell so you'll miss the next episode, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.